Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
So we decided today to talk about chronic lateness, which is an issue that comes up for a lot of people in their lives. It's also an issue that comes up a lot in therapy with sometimes clients, the same clients showing up week after week, a little bit late for an appointment. And of course, then it becomes the subject of therapeutic curiosity. So there are many things that this phenomenon can mean, and we're going to circumambulate it today and see what we can decide about it.
Yeah, I think that chronic lateness is such a universal frustration, both for people who are chronically late because they've paid a lot of prices around this. They're often embarrassed or ashamed. The family members are frustrated with them, and they often feel kind of trapped in this pattern of behavior, and they can't quite get out of it.
There's a real relational price for being late, is what I'm building on here, both for the person who loses friends and could even lose a job, fail classes, and for the people who know that person. I've had a couple of people in my life who are chronically late, and unless it is completely unavoidable, I do not make plans with them that entail timeliness. And that means certain activities are avoided even when we have addressed it because there's a relational price to be paid.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I would like to introduce just as an overarching theme is that people who are chronically late in some way are split.
Yes.
Yes, right? So they have a conscious attitude where they're saying, oh, I don't want to be late. I don't want to be late. Or they're constantly apologizing, or the ego, the part of them that's out front is racing or struggling or dreading. And yet there's another personality inside of them, which we might say is the unconscious itself, which has a totally different plan and is not interested in arriving on time or is pulling the person in other directions and thwarting the conscious life. So I think the first part that seems so true to me is that there's a real wrestling match. There's a battle going on in most late people's psyches.
I like that framing of it, Joseph, and it might be worth saying that kind of split between the agenda of the conscious personality and the unconscious agenda of some other part of us would be one definition of neurosis.
Yes, it would.
And I'm thinking that this leads us into a particularly Jungian stance around this. Because most of the time with self-help and so on is always addressing the ego's position of, well, you can set 2 alarm clocks so that you wake up on time. You can make a list. You can break down your tasks into a more realistic time frame, etc. But our interest is in what is that other part of you that insists on being late? What does that mean? What is it saying? It's kind of like a dream, only it's a waking dream and it's a bad dream.
It is a bad dream. It's a nightmare for people when they're like dreading walking into the meeting 20 minutes late again. It's a total nightmare.
And that's, if I have someone who comes in late repeatedly and, they always show up 5 or 10 minutes late and they're always apologizing. And, one of the first things I'll do is try to kind of dampen down the shame around it and say, well, let's get curious about it. Like, tell me about that, what happened that you were late today, and what is that part of you wanting to communicate? What is trying to get in the room here through this behavior? Try to make space for that.
So that brings in the idea of ambivalence of, part of me wants to be there, part of me doesn't. And from a Jungian point of view, as Joseph, as you've said, it means ambivalence is the conscious attitude is in one place and the unconscious is somewhere else.
So one thing I'd love to just toss out, and before I say that, is while lateness can be a single category in terms of the topic of the podcast, that the way in which that's woven into each late person's psyche can be incredibly unique. And that's why I think some of these self-help programs, which are distributed to the public, often don't work because it's very specific to the individual.
Yeah, maybe I'll just kind of dive in with a story of my own. I have a couple of lateness stories. I think I've shared one on a previous episode of the podcast, but here's something that I noticed when I was in college, okay? So I was that person who walked into every class like 5 minutes late, always. But I noticed that when I set an appointment with a friend to meet them somewhere, especially if that place were, in public or outside or something like that, I was on time, if not early. It wasn't conscious. I wasn't consciously deciding in this instance I will be late and in this instance I will be on time or early. But I noticed that pattern and I got really interested in it. And I realized that it felt really unacceptable to me to leave a friend standing outside the dining hall, for example, waiting for me in the cold or the wind or the rain or whatever, versus to me, it felt like walking into class 5 minutes late didn't do anyone any harm, which of course is not true. But that's what I told myself.
But there was an imaginal lacuna.
Yes, yes.
So when you imagine walking into the class late, there was just kind of a blankness there versus imagining your friend being uncomfortable or suffering.
In a way, I'm still tracking the relational component of lateness, and that when there is a friend there, you don't want to hurt the friend's feelings and you matter. But where that, in a classroom or a lecture hall full of people, who knows, who cares? There's no relational component. I mean, that's a false belief, but that may have been part of it, as it doesn't matter.
And no one cares. And as an additional part of that is sometimes people who are chronically late have an unconscious fantasy that they are invisible and unsubstantial.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Joseph.
And thinking of a clinical example in the back of my mind, that person had other kinds of interesting behaviors that reinforce the idea of being invisible. For instance, they would often find themselves in a public place staring at somebody who is maybe 7 or 8 feet away and causing the other person to become very nervous and not realizing that they could be seen while they were staring at someone, that they were surprised to discern that.
Right. It is. I mean, being chronically late, a part of that can be not recognizing that you have an impact on other people.
Yes, that you are substantial in the settings that you're arriving to.
I think that's really important. The impact means that you are substantial, and versus the temptation that may be linked to low self-esteem or some deficit in the sense of self-worth of, I don't really matter. It doesn't really matter if I'm 20 minutes late. I'm not big enough. I'm not important enough. I'm not worthy enough.
I think that can be one narrative, absolutely.
Yes, one narrative.
Another piece I wanted to bring forward in terms of this idea of a split in the psyche is that for many people, having access to their aggression is deeply thwarted. So particularly, let's say in work situations where the persona is expected to be very well groomed and totally regulated and constantly optimistic. So there's not a lot of space for bringing aggression forward. And so our aggression and anger often sinks into the unconscious and takes on a life of its own. And one of the ways that I imagine that is that anything that's banished from the conscious mind is banished into a wilderness, into a kind of forest. And things that have to live in a forest become wild and uncivilized. So we have this uncivilized anger and aggression that's lurking around in the unconscious. And one of the ways that will leak that out is through passive aggressive behavior. So not showing up on time can be a way that the unconscious banished anger is staking a claim, is making itself known.
Right. It's a real assertion of something. It's an unconscious, as you said, passive aggressive assertion that I have the right to take up this much space, or that my time is more valuable than yours, or
I don't have to play by your rules.
yeah.
Yes, thumbing your nose at an authority figure, but also it's punishing
Hmm.
because the individual knows on a conscious level that they're gumming up the meeting, that somebody is standing there impatiently waiting for them, and that is a kind of low level punishment to the other persons.
Hmm. Yeah, it's definitely aggressive.
Hmm. And even though the ego, the conscious mind, may feel very ashamed, there's a figure in the unconscious mind that is like capering and dancing around the fire with a certain kind of unconscious delight.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, when I even think of my example going back to college and me kind of walking in the classroom or the lecture hall 5 minutes late all the time, I think my outward stance was I was compliant and I was nice and I was buttoned up or whatever. I was a good student, whatever my persona was. But I think the lateness was partly an unconscious claiming of I don't need to stay inside the lines all the time, and it wasn't particularly adaptive because I'm sure it didn't help me to be 5 minutes late all the time, and it was certainly disruptive to my classmates. But it, unconsciously, it was a strategy for claiming more space.
Right. It's a kind of inelegant attempt at individuation.
Hmm.
Hmm. That's a really great way to say it, Joseph. And an inelegant attempt at individuation of see me, I do my own thing, I follow my own path as you sort of try to slither into the meeting or climb over people who are already sitting in the row to get to a seat in the middle. It requires being noticed, even if your supervisor is mad at you for being late again.
I'm enjoying that split, imagining that, where the ego is kind of, slumping its shoulders and slouching into the appointment. But there's this kind of inner wild figure that's delightfully dancing around a fire because it's caused this tumult. And that in the end, if that's true, let's say in this particular person, that one of the therapeutic movements is to ask that angry figure to come forward to dialogue with the analyst, but also for the ego to go inside and envision their angry self and begin to listen to it. And sometimes this is already present in the dreams. There is some kind of a figure that's chasing the ego, which many times is the disowned anger, or seems monstrous and is pounding, breaking down the door. And the only way out of that is for the waking mind to open that door and stick out a hand and say, glad to meet you.
Yeah, it can be difficult if it's so split off that the person just has trouble relating to it at all or imagining that might be part of them. That's, it can be sometimes just so disowned that it can't really be related to. And I think shame kind of plays a role in that because Joseph, I'm really with you with this image of this kind of this shadowy part dancing, gleefully dancing around the fire. But again, the conscious personality in the room is just so soaked in shame that here they are late again. And I feel like that shame really can block kind of openness and curiosity and just a kind of, I don't know, reflective capacity to begin to be curious about what's going on with this other part that always wants to hijack the schedule. And it can make it more difficult.
It is. And in that way, shame is a defense against self reflection. And that's true about anything that we consider a taboo. So there's all kinds of cultural taboos that if we approach it, the unconscious stuns us like a stun gun with shame to kind of make us pull our hands back. But then there are things that shouldn't be taboo, like acknowledging that one is angry, which the psyche will still treat with an enormous amount of shame to stun us away from developing a proper relationship with it.
Yeah, I like that. A defense against self-reflection.
I'm thinking that there are also narcissistic defenses against self-reflection.
Mm-hmm.
Of that there are people who really simply don't care. They may be in positions of power and or other factors leading them simply to deny that their lateness has much of an impact on anyone else. Uh, I'm entitled. I come in when it works for me. And simply dismissing or minimizing the effect on other people because it's a me first attitude.
And this would be the person who doesn't feel any conscious shame around their lateness.
Where it's a feeling of entitlement or imperiousness, that when the king or the queen, decides to come into the court, everybody else is going to pretend that that's the perfect time that things should begin. And I think that people that have particularly an alpha narcissistic personality want to have that experience that the world waits upon them. And even if they have to unconsciously create the theater of that kind of an event, it still can be co-opted by the narcissistic character to feed the feeling that they're important. And the reason that seems like such a necessary food to the narcissist is that deep down in their soul, they don't feel important. They feel small and disowned and frightened and having very little value. So then they pursue these tactics to create the illusion that they are more important than they actually feel. And that costs a lot to the people around them.
Yeah, and I think that that kind of behavior, you can see that in people who don't even necessarily look like alpha narcissists. They may be, very, very fun-loving and very charming, but they just don't seem to be able to kind of orient to time, and therefore they wind up creating these situations socially in which other people wind up having to kind of accommodate themselves to them. And it can bring up, if you're on the receiving end of that kind of behavior, it can bring up an enormous amount of anger.
Oh, absolutely. Because the person on the receiving end of that really feels the jolt. They feel the meta communication of somebody who's kept them waiting, and particularly kept them waiting repeatedly. I think that any of us that are reasonably well adapted can make room for people who are late occasionally because of circumstances. An accident happens on the road, a child gets sick, and people who are responsible for that will send a text message, sorry, running 10 minutes late, accident on the road. And so it's easy to be graceful in that situation. But the fourth, fifth, 25th time that it happens, then there's a larger communication that is absolutely being delivered, and people get the message.
I want to move into, a slightly different way of looking at this because I think that it can be really destructive and sending people a message and related to narcissism. It also, and Joseph, I think this goes back to your wonderful language about an inelegant attempt at individuation. It's like when we don't feel entitled to something, but we want it, some part of our psyche wants it and knows that we need to have it. We may initially reach for it in a way that has some trickster energy in it. We may do it in a passive aggressive way. So it may be awkward, it may be maladaptive, it may be inconsiderate and all kinds of other things, but that attempt to kind of ask for more, that desire to take up more space can be the beginning of an authentic movement toward individuation. And I'm thinking of the fairy tale of Cinderella, and we know it. Most of us are most familiar with the French version, in which, of course, she tarries too long at the ball and winds up having to dash out at the stroke of midnight and thereby loses her glass slipper. And so, in this sense, yes, she was late. She wasn't paying attention to the time. She allowed herself, she dared to allow herself to enjoy the scene of the ball and to be in these beautiful surroundings and these beautiful clothes, not in her customary role of the servant girl. And in that, so we could say that her psyche was attempting to feel more comfortable being bigger and taking up more space and daring to ask for more. And of course, in the story, it's unfortunate that she's late because her coach has turned into a pumpkin, et cetera, et cetera. But the fact that she lost the slipper is the very thing that leads to the conjunctio, the happy fulfillment and movement toward wholeness at the end of the tale.
That's lovely. And, I think the carryover is that being chronically late, like many other things, really is a plea from the unconscious to pay more attention to yourself. Of the here was Cinderella's unconscious, we might posit, making her late in the interest of her self-development. So what looks like shadow is, oh my gosh, I'm late again and I'm ashamed of myself, is also a beckoning and a message of, look at this. We're trying to get the personalities in in my unconscious are trying to get attention, trying to tell you something. It's very much the same process as with a dream, which is why we pay attention to dreams. What is there for the conscious mind to learn and to grow from?
Yes, and we value this communication even when it appears in the form of someone being chronically late.
So, so Cinderella at the ball and how she behaves there is a compensation for the diminished state she has in her day-to-day life. So the rising up, the princess part of her personality, which has been subdued in her servant life, compensates or balances her psyche out. And that when we're in a compensation, and this happens in dreams, where we will dream of ourselves being quite different from our day-to-day life, there's a way in which we are kind of starving for the compensation. And when I think of her as kind of starving for the experience of being loved and being elegant, that it's hard to break away from that just because of an abstract idea such as, the time is running out or the clock's going to strike 12. And I think about this with some of my clients who have attention deficit disorder, that there's a way in which they're so engrossed with something that's pleasurable to them that it's hard for them to tear themselves away just because of an abstract idea such as, it's 4 o'clock and it's time to leave. That abstract scheduling demand simply doesn't have enough weight in the deliciousness of whatever they're involved in.
Well, I think that can be true for any of us, right? Especially, Joseph, as you say, if we're sort of starving, if the psyche is really in need of something, and then when we get a little bit of it, we just want to hang on to it as long as possible.
And that too raises the question of, and what about that? What will you, whoever the you is, what do you want to do about it? It's the pleasure principle, and is that always the basis upon which to make choices and decisions but I was so engrossed in this worthwhile task, let's say. I'm late for a business meeting or to meet a friend or something else. Okay, that too is trying to get our attention and in the interests of adapting to reality and a world that really does run a lot of the time on clock time.
Mm-hmm. Where I'm going in my imagination, Deb, to this idea of the pleasure principle is, can somebody who's chronically late develop a way of imagining that the next event could also be as pleasurable as what they are engrossed in? Is there perhaps a negative bias in the imagination that it's hard for them to believe that coming to that meeting or meeting the friend for lunch or showing up at work, with a smile on your face and being affirmed by the coworkers, it's hard for them to believe that they would derive any pleasure from that.
Mm-hmm. Or even going to bed on time.
Oh, yeah.
I don't mean right on the dot of, let's say, 11 o'clock, but that there is maybe an underlying neediness of and a need for self-soothing of, I'm just going to watch one more episode of whatever the show is. I'm just going to read one more chapter. I'm going to keep on talking to my friend on the phone. And that too is compensating for an inner lack of connection or pleasure or soothing. So I don't want to go to bed.
Yeah, I can so remember my stepkids just crying when it was bedtime. That was like an incredible punishment to take them away from something that was pleasurable to them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, going. I mean, I just staying on this. I just want to reference back to Cinderella for just a second. Cinderella has always seemed to me to be a tale about a wounded entitlement, and I think that this idea about being, Joseph, what you were saying about not being able to kind of tear yourself away from something that feels pleasurable in the interest of this kind of ego demand of switching into another task. It's like we know we need something, but that need isn't really integrated. We haven't vested that need internally with enough kind of seriousness and energy. We're not taking it seriously enough. So it kind of kicks around back in the background and hijacks us. Whereas if we can say to ourselves, it's really important for me to, X, Y, or Z, whatever the thing is that we're doing. And I know that this matters to me and I need to make time for it. Then it's much easier, I think, to say, and I can't do that right now because it's time to leave for work. So it has something to do with orienting to these demands from the unconscious in a way that if we, paradoxically, the more seriously we take those demands, the more choice we'll have about how we relate to them. It's because we know when we take those needs seriously, we know that we will take the time to get those needs met. And we have a choice about when we do it. It doesn't feel like it's feast or famine, all or nothing. We have to do it right now.
I think that what you've said is absolutely right on and beautifully said, Lisa, that we have to be able to dialogue with that inner figure that's so hungry for something and to reassure that part of ourselves that we know what they need, that the ego is going to make sure that it gets what it needs and it doesn't have to fear being forgotten or banished. And that has to be a conscious process in order to kind of quiet that storm in the unconscious and that desperation in the unconscious.
I'm wondering just if we can focus for a minute on, we've been alluding to this throughout, but specifically as it relates to clients, because I don't know about you, but I think for me, it's pretty common to have people who are chronically late. They're late to each and every session. And then it becomes, as I said earlier, kind of the lateness becomes an object of therapeutic curiosity. Is that something that is up for the two of you?
Yeah, I think we can talk about it in a kind of broad way. So I can think of one situation where, actually, I think probably about a couple of clients over time that discovered the rushing to the next appointment was exciting to them. And it gave them a sense of adrenaline.
Mm-hmm.
And that search for adrenaline was something that was also affecting other areas of their life. And that underneath that were other difficult feelings like anxiety or emptiness. So by creating these kind of small dramas where they're racing to appointments, it actually successfully defended them against underlying feelings that they really had been avoiding. And that feeling of the rush to arrive can be a little bit addictive.
Yeah. It's a false way of pursuing a sense of aliveness gambling with time, that if I do this and this and this, and then the traffic is like this, and I don't hit any red lights, or the subway train arrives right as I'm hitting the subway station, then everything will work out okay. And it is anxiety producing often for people, but there is also that rush of adrenaline, which can feel like excitement or aliveness.
Wow, Deb, I just love that. Gambling with time is
I
a
was
way
just
of
thinking that.
pursuing a false sense of aliveness. That's just perfect. Yeah.
It's exquisite. Absolutely. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Gambling with time.
Yeah. And I'm chuckling because, as I think I related on an earlier podcast, I did, and this is relevant too. I by the time I got to graduate school, I was still coming late to every class. And what I used to tell myself was, I went to school and I got my master's at New York University, and I lived in Brooklyn, and the subways were such that if the train was or pulling into the station as I descended the stairs and I got immediately on this one train, then I would be on time, right? So I would walk into class late and I would tell myself, well, it's because the subway was late. And then I was like, well, no, the subway's not late because there's no guarantee. Like, I'm not guaranteed that the train is pulling up right as I arrive, right? You have to like budget time in to wait for the train. But somehow I had constructed this really kind of maladaptive fantasy that the train will be waiting for me when I descend the stairs at the station, which, happened like 1 out of 8 times, but mostly didn't.
So these stories that we can concoct in our own heads, or takes me back to our phrase of magical thinking, which is really a form of self-deception.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
This is how the world should be, and it makes sense. My narrative makes sense. We make up stories about things all the time, the meaning that we attribute to things. Then we believe our own stories, and we have deceived ourselves.
And that can show up in all areas of life.
Yes.
But this, but I'm sweating a little bit right now as I'm like, coursing back through my life. But particularly around this issue of chronic lateness, that there really are a lot of really unrealistic thoughts and beliefs that are floating around.
Right. And the question becomes, I think self-deception is probably a big piece in chronic lateness always. Maybe I'd have to think about that more to be able to say with certainty, but my hunch is yes. Okay, but then the question is back to why? Why did I have that story? What was wanting to take shape there, And I think it probably had something to do with the same thing I referenced earlier, that on the outside I was compliant and I was, following all the rules. And there was this one part of me that was like, I don't want to follow the rules all the time. I want to be able to kind of stake something out for myself. It's just, that's not really a great way to do it, right?
Yes, but I think coming back to the magical thinking, which is kind of the interfering fantasy that's, misdirecting the ego, I think it's really kind of marvelous if people can make note of the magical fantasy and then to analyze that as if it was a dream. So if I were to just put myself into your trying to get to the school on time, this idea that the whole universe would magically cooperate with you, that the train would magically arrive and the streetlight would magically change color, sensing your magnificent arrival. That's a tremendously exciting view of our place and the way that the universe is tending to us.
Yeah.
And that fantasy shows up in all kinds of New Age literature and a lot of kind of fairy tales that things will accommodate us miraculously.
Well, I just want to clarify that I didn't need the whole universe to line up with me. I just needed the B train.
Absolutely. Like a magical chariot that would sense your arrival and just be there. But see, if we've got that kind of magical idea in the back of our mind. Then when the universe occasionally lines up and you step onto the platform and the train is exactly pulling into the station, there's a feeling of gasping, delightful reaffirmation that magic does happen. This is a magical universe. And then part of the unconscious, again, is skipping around that fire, wanting to reproduce that wonderful experience, which I think is all of us can fall into that.
I think some of this with magical thinking, especially, and we all have some of it, it takes me back to the very early developmental stage, of a baby and cause and effect. That, if the baby cries, then mommy appears to hold him, to feed him, to rock him. So it's perfectly reasonable in the baby's mind that the world does accommodate to me. See, every time I cry, I get fed. It's great. And then we carry it over in adult life to, if I need the subway train to appear or my boss to cut me some slack or something else, the world will accommodate me. Will the world accommodate me? Should the world accommodate me? And eventually the baby learns that mommy doesn't appear the instant he or she starts to whimper. And eventually we engage much later on, probably forever, in understanding the difference between our internal reality and our internal needs and the external world.
I want to say that in line with that, Deb, there's this hilarious YouTube video that floats around on Facebook. So there's this kind of meathead young husband who's sitting in a living room with his wife, and she starts to complain about how the house is just a mess. And then finally the husband looks over to her and says, I haven't wanted to tell you this, but something is happening in the house which is amazing. Like every day I leave all of this stuff on the coffee table in the living room, and the next morning it's gone. And then he takes her into the laundry room and he goes, I just throw my clothes on the floor in here, and then 24 hours later it's on my bed. And then there's a flash of the wife's eyes who's just like horrified and enraged. It's a hilarious video, but it speaks to this dimension.
Yes. I want to raise a slightly different aspect maybe of chronic lateness that I think can go on. And that is, it's a little bit more poignant or sweeter or something, but I think many of us can relate to it. It's a difficulty accepting limitation. And I think it's related to this kind of magical thinking. It's like, gosh, I used to do this all the time. This was probably the number one cause of why I would be late, is I would underestimate, for example, how long it might take me to get somewhere, because I really wanted to do both things. I didn't want to have to say, I can't, spend time with this friend because I already committed to do this other thing. I just so wanted to be able to do both things that I convinced myself that both were possible. So there's this sense of just having to kind of adapt to the reality principle of, no, it actually does take 40 minutes in crosstown traffic. And so that means, ergo, it's impossible to do both things, Lisa. It took a while to do that. Or even sometimes it was, I didn't want to disappoint someone. I didn't want to say no. So I'd say, well, yeah, I can do that. And then later on, like, oh my God, what was I thinking? So it's just this kind of young place, it feels, of having a hard time just saying, no, there are these, hard and fast realities. They haven't invented a transporter yet. So, and that for me leans into this other place of how we think about time and how the unconscious processes time. And that's this Greek, there were two words for time in Greek. One was Chronos, which is sort of everyday clock time. And it's this kind of inexorable thing that it's just, like it or not, it's there. And it does take time to get to the appointment, or 4:00 is going to come and we're going to have to do whatever it was we said we were going to do. But then there's also Kairos, which is this kind of sacred time, which is experienced very differently. When we're in Kairos, there is a suspension of that sense of clock time. There is a kind of limitlessness to it. And I think that in some sense, being adapted to both inner and outer life means that we can find time and space to be in Kairos at times, at the same time acknowledging the need to listen to the master, that is Chronos.
I think that's just beautifully said, Lisa, and it lifts it to a much more existential dimension. And it also suggests that people have to really take responsibility for needing both of those experiences. I can think of someone who I'm close to who is enslaved to Chronos and laments it and really suffers greatly, and that, has to fight to give themselves permission for those Kairos experiences, to have an entire day that is unstructured and responds just to their intuition or to what they find beautiful. So we can have kind of these internalized parents sometimes who are constantly scolding us for not staying on task and not being relentlessly productive. And those are the agents of Chronos. So sometimes we have to really fight to find both sides of that.
Yeah, it's lovely, and it's very, very important that we have some time for introspection, for timelessness, to dip into those deep inner wells that are life renewing. And I think that ties in so well with everything we're saying about what is the unconscious saying to you, and that there's a legitimacy there of a need, which I think about for you, Lisa, in being late to class and wanting the subway the train to be right there for you. Of that you there was a real need there of, I want a more leisurely morning, let's say. I don't want to have to jump up and start in with all those ego-oriented, time-limited activities of my day. I also need some reverie.
Yes. And does the soul sometimes hijack the ego to create those unstructured experiences because we're not admitting to ourselves that we do need unstructured time in order to listen to the soul and listen to spirit? I think that's a marvelous way to frame it, and perhaps a good note to end on so we can transition into the dream.
Hi, this is Lisa from This Jungian Life podcast. Joseph, Deb, and I have been deeply moved by your responses to our work. Producing, editing, and distributing the podcast involves substantial expenses, and we need your help. Please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the heading Be Our Patron. You'll be redirected to our Patreon funding page. Patreon helps creators connect with people who believe in projects like ours. There, you can sign up with your credit card to support us for as little as $1 a month, and at higher levels of support, we'll provide special episodes, behind-the-scenes photos and stories, and a chance to join a select pool of listeners for dream interpretations. Thank you.
Here is the dream from a man who's 25 years old and who works as an EMT. I begin the dream in a giant mall-like building. It stretches as far as I can see. There are no stores or other people. There are only dozens of escalators at different levels leading different places, much like a multi-story maze. I find the place exciting in its expanse. I next find myself leaving the building through an outdoor walkway, which leads to a little cabin surrounded by plants, trees, and grass. There are 5 or 6 other people here, all of whom I consider friends. Suddenly, I'm aware I need to fetch something from the basement of the giant building. Problem is, I need a key. Everyone has a key except I lost mine. There's an extra key in the cabin, but I'm told it's possessed and I shouldn't use it. However, whatever it is I need from the basement is tremendously important, so I decide to grab the key and go. I venture back to the building and make my way up and down many escalators, finally finding the basement. I don't remember anything about the basement, only that I find what I'm looking for. I'm excited as I make my way back to the cabin. However, once I reach it, my vision becomes entirely blue. Yellow words flash up on what looks like a blue screen, though I don't know what the writing says. The blue screen disappears quickly, and what's left is a purplish gray screen with a black orb in the bottom right corner. I understand the orb to be an eye, which watches me intently. I wake up with my heart racing. Well, this is a pretty complicated dream with various levels of action, and I'm going immediately to the key, which seems to me to be the key to the dream, as well as for this dreamer. And I'm remembering the book by Bly about how every young man needs, Robert Bly, about Iron John, and how every young man needs to steal the key from under the mother's pillow. So this is a really archetypal image, since it shows up in the fairy tale of Iron John.
Yeah, it's interesting that the key is possessed, isn't it?
And I'm wondering if it's possessed by other people or if it's possessed by, some kind of evil spirit or something. Either way, it's possessed.
So I actually want to sort of start at the beginning because I find the setting of this dream really kind of extraordinary. And it's interesting because it's a mall-like building. It's massive, and there are no stores or other people. And the dreamer says that he finds the place exciting in its expanse. To me, my personal felt sense of this image is it's a little disturbing to me, this kind of maze-like, all these escalators. It feels really it's obviously really mechanical and sort of there's an inhuman quality to it. And it sounds like it would be distressing to be lost inside in my imagination. Obviously, that is not the dreamer's experience, but I'm just tracking my own reaction to it is different from the dreamer's reaction to it. It sounds not exactly claustrophobic, but that it would be a frightening place to be lost in. And so alone. I mean, it's this vast, expansive place, and there's no one there. And then the next part of the setting is so different. It's a little cabin surrounded by plants, trees, and grass. So we have a totally different feeling tone. This is organic. This is in the natural world. And there are 5 or 6 other people here, all of whom are friends. So now there's a very different feel. And somehow, I'm not sure exactly what to do about this, but the fact that the action in the dream moves back and forth between these two places feels significant.
Well, I'd like to bring us back to the context for the dream, which is a little bit lower down on the form that the person filled out, which I think will help us understand the division in the dream. He says, I'm enlisted in the military, though I'm working on my master's in psychology. I'm considering leaving the military and applying to PhD programs in a couple of years, but I still don't know specifically what I want to do. So holding that in mind, it makes me wonder if the giant mall-like building is an apt metaphor for the military construct. Here in Hampton Roads, a large percentage of my practice is working with active duty military. And as I've come to understand their experience of being in the military, it really is an enormous hive-like structure where people and resources are being almost kind of automatically and bureaucratically transported around, not unlike innumerable elevators. And the sense that the dreamer is alone in that giant mall-like building, I think also captures the feeling of isolation that active duty military often feel, despite the fact that they are surrounded by other people. But there's an enormous sense of burden and self-responsibility and lack of help around the things that are expected of them. So I would be tempted to imagine that this is the way that his psyche is internalizing his experience of being in the military. And when he finds that transition into the cabin surrounded by plants and trees and grass, my fantasy is that when he carves time out away from his military experience and pursues his master's in psychology, that it's a private space and it's full of images of life and growing things. You know, the word psychology comes from the word psyche, which means soul or the study of the soul. So the beginning of the dream is set up with this tension between these two values that he's pursuing and the way in which those two values are held in his psyche as specific landscapes, which he needs to decide how he wants to navigate. The fact that it's exciting to be in the giant mall-like building suggests to me that there is something exciting about being part of this great machine of the military, that it's not a totally negative experience for him at all, which is probably why it's difficult for him to make a decision to leave.
Yeah, for me, one of the things that came up as I sat with this dream is related to this work by a psychiatrist named Ian McGilchrist in his book, The Master and His Emissary. And he talks about the nature of the world that is brought into being when attended to by the left brain versus the right brain. And the world that is brought into being when attended to by the left brain tends to be more mechanical, more mechanistic, more kind of goal directed, purposive, decontextualized, where that which is brought into being when attended to by the right brain is more natural, more organic, more holistic. And it feels a little bit like we might be in that territory in the dream, which I think Joseph does, is also in the same territory as the point you were raising about these different domains of the military versus psychology. Although I don't know what graduate school in psychology is like. I don't know how much soul is there. But the dream itself would point to perhaps the need to integrate something between these two different modes of being. Something needs to be brought over from the mall-like building, the basement of the mall-like building. Something needs to be transported between these two environments. And it's not really entirely successful, right? Somehow that which is brought over from the mall-like building, when it gets to the cabin, there's this distressing thing that happens that's really rather curious.
Right. So he finds something in the basement, which is often a ubiquitous symbol of the unconscious, or at least going to a deeper level of his psychological life, that he is able to tolerate the fear that the key will possess him or will influence him in some way where he will lose control. I think that's the idea of possession. But he's able to successfully navigate whatever potential the key has and to retrieve something. But the ego is not able to retain a clear image of it. But we do have some images about how the ego is affected by its retrieval, which is this changing images of color and flashing lights, and then the great orb, which seems to be an eye that is looking at him.
I'm aware as we're talking that I've been relatively silent and that I am anxious. That this dream has created a level of anxiety in me with the image of this sort of impersonal, mechanistic mall, and that the dreamer says, I find it exciting. He says, I find the place exciting in its expanse. And then this key is possessed. He takes it anyway, gets what he needs from the basement, and is excited again as he makes his way back to the cabin. And then this somewhat distressing lysis or conclusion to the dream. And I am wondering about this excitement and possession and this orb to be an eye watching him. What is so fraught here that's being compensated for perhaps by his tendency to feeling excited rather than grounded and present?
Can you unpack that a little more, Deb? What are you imagining about that?
What I imagine around excitement is, that things are adrenalized and we're in an action mode, but without a capacity necessarily for self-reflection. We've sort of gone airborne, as it were, of, oh my God, this is so exciting. Oh my, look at this. I'm excited. But that is up in the air rather than I am grounded. I am able to integrate this. So it feels a little disconnected of, I did the daring thing and I grabbed the key and I got my stuff, but I'm not holding on to it. And then this last part of the dream comes up, that there's some communication. Yellow words flash up on what looks like a blue screen, but he can't read the words.
Yeah, it certainly feels like a warning, doesn't it?
Yeah, he says, I wake up with my heart racing, which is, given what's just happened, completely understandable. So that's another form of excitement. His physiology is activated, excited. That's where I am, is with this feeling of excitement / anxiety that I think is a thread running through the dream.
When I think of him being a 25-year-old male who's currently working as an EMT, so I have some fantasies about that. This is somebody who gravitates to excitement and intensity, and his psyche, or the way the ego is navigating in the psyche, also has that same sense of emergency. An emergency medical technician, an EMT. So he's moving fast and dynamically, and finds that familiar at the very least. I think the flashing lights at the end do remind me a little bit of him arriving at a disaster site, and there's all kinds of different colored flashing lights. And in that world of emergency response, the flashing lights are warning lights, but they're also informational, that different groups of responders have different color lights. Police have blue lights, and the different responders have different colored lights. So it'd be interesting if he was here to talk about how different colored flashing lights, what that means to him in a known environment, which also is the sense that an emergency has happened. The last bit there, I'm more drawn to the orb, which he takes to be an eye that's looking at him, because the sense of emergency and flashing lights, I think, is kind of familiar to the ego. But the orb to me represents an encounter with the self, an encounter with the transpersonal. When we think of the eye in the pyramid of the $1 bill that's floating above, that represents the presence of the divine that is ever attending to the universe and to each of us individually. So the eye that's watching him intently, to me, suggests a growing awareness that there is something more than his ego, which is participating in this, in his life in general, but also in this choice of how he will set his path looking forward. And that this is not solely a personal decision, but there is a transpersonal dimension to what he's trying to figure out for himself. And at 25 years old, that can be unnerving.
I maybe, and I like what you've done with it, and I'm really intrigued by it. But I want to say that I had a different kind of intuitive hit about that eye, which so I it would be great if it's as you're saying. And again, if we had this person here, we could explore what was the feeling tone of the eye. But this black orb in the bottom right corner, which is understood to be an eye watching him intently. To me, the feeling tone is not the kind of awe that I would expect if it were really kind of a manifestation of the self. It feels more paranoid to me. And and of course we don't know, but if it's more in that direction, then I think I'm back up with Deb about something big is happening, right? This important thing has been brought over from the basement of the mall-like building to the cabin. It's been successful and there's excitement, but something's not getting grounded or integrated at this point. It's almost like there's too much distress around it or too much fear around it. And it's kind of, I like what Deb said, sort of shot us off into the stratosphere or something. But we don't know for sure.
No, we don't, but there is a thread here, and I'm going back to the key, which the dreamer is told is possessed. That's a daring to, in grabbing the key or an encounter with possession is sort of the dark side of the psyche or the unconscious and what we do with that. And this dark orb seems like an echo of that other image of dealing with the unconscious in its dark aspect. In other words, dealing with shadow. As he wrestles with his desire, the dilemma that you pointed out, Joseph, of, should I leave the military and do this? I don't know exactly what I want to do, but I'm interested in this other thing.
Yes, I think you're right, Deb.
So if we frame it again back in the context, and I'm going to lean into what you guys are saying, is it's not uncommon for people to be drawn to mental health careers because there is a nagging mystery in their own personalities which they are hoping to solve. So if he does have something in the basement of his personality which troubles him, and studying psychology is the key, that it may be some attempt to understand this energy, this feeling, this image in the unconscious, which is problematic or frightening to him.
Yeah, I like that, Joseph. And what's coming up for me with what Deb did of kind of linking the possessed key with the black orb is, sometimes there are things in the unconscious that are kind of too strong for us to deal with, and we need more ego strength in order to be able to meet the contents of the unconscious. And perhaps this dreamer is in that place of, which would not at all be, would be entirely developmentally appropriate to be doing some ego strength work at age 25. It's because I think that idea about possession that really shows the possibility of a kind of destructive incursion from the unconscious.
Yes. And I think the study of psychology is very much an encounter with our own shadows. Just what you were saying, Joseph, of some of the unresolved issues or mysteries in our own life. Shadow's big, and we will encounter it in studying psychology. It's just part of it.
It reminds me that in many of the hero fairy tales, as the hero approaches the daunting task, which might be dealing with what's in the basement, that he needs to go through certain experiences and accumulate allies in order to be ready to take the final battle, the plunge. And so we might imagine this young man still in this place of finding his allies, both inward and outward, before he can really grapple with what's in the dark. And maybe that's an okay place to pause for today.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.